Hey, welcome back to the shed. I'm Fred, and today we're going to be looking at two 35mm cameras from the 1970s. These are both made by Halina, and this is the Halina 2000 and its slightly bigger brother, the Halina 3000. So we'll start with the Halina 3000. This was the direct replacement for the Halina Palette Electronic, which is what I looked at earlier. Introduced in 1974. Made in Hong Kong, as were all Halina cameras, by W. Hucking Enterprises. As with the Paulette, it was also sold under different names. In the UK there was a Dixon's version, which would have been Prinz something or other, and that came in actually quite a nice matte black finish, and they're a little rare now, but they actually do look rather nice. Okay, what do you get? Well, it's a 45mm f2.8 lens. You have a 4-speed leaf shutter lens ranging from a maximum speed of 250th of a second all the way down to 30th of a second, and of course you have B-stop. On this model as well, so you may notice you've actually got a hot shoe there on the flash bracket. Again, flash sync was only actually at a maximum of 1/30th of a second, so not particularly fast, and it also came rather conveniently with a standard PC socket if your flash gun actually didn't support the hot shoe. So when you look at the camera, it's interesting to compare it to its predecessor, the Paulette. It's a very similar camera. The actual casework, it's been sort of very much squared off in the sort of very 1970s retro way. I've got to be, the lens is a little disappointing, to be honest. If you look at the focusing ring here, okay, it's been slightly, the gearing has been slightly raised, so you only have to sort of turn it maybe sort of 30% of its travel now, but you've lost that rather nice machined aluminium ring, and you have a kind of a cast affair with, which has got this sort of rubber grip. I mean, it's perfectly usable, but it does kind of perhaps reflect a slight lessening in quality. Works the same as the Paulette. You have a selenium cell here on the front of the camera, and this operates a little light meter here, which is numbered from 7 to 17, and as I say, the same system would be, you would guessomatic your distance on here. You've got no things like autofocus. It's not a rangefinder camera, so you would guess your subject will say, for example, 10 feet. You read your light meter reading, comes out at about 12 here, and then depending on your speed of film, once again exactly the same, you've got a little adjustment here which you would slide there on the bottom. That's your ISO, or which is the same as equivalent to your ISO setting. And if your subject was, for example, moving, you might wish to choose a slightly faster lens setting, shutter setting, say 125 or even possibly 250, but we'll stick with 125 for now. And then you've got your aperture setting down the bottom here, and then all you had to do really was just line up the little window there on the lens barrel. As long as that corresponded with the actual setting there in you could just about make that out, in your EV setting in your light meter, then you knew your exposure was correct. This is actually my own personal camera. This is my first camera. I had this when I was, oh wow, probably 11 or 12 or something, and I've run quite a few films through this, and I found that this system, although perhaps a little basic, it actually worked quite well. So there we go. So once again, if you was perhaps taking a portrait photography, you could work the other way, and you may wish to have your lens further open, maybe f4, f2.8, and then depending on your ASA or ISO speed, you would then adjust your shutter speed accordingly to try and give yourself a little bit more depth of field. And that's really about it. Very sort of basic camera. A little bit lighter than the Paulette. To say once again, that might reflect in lessening of quality of materials. They, on the back of the camera here, they've still stuck with the actual film counter, which again, most cameras would have had it up the top here, but they carried on with it being at the bottom. You've got a standard standard tripod threaded bracket there, and then you've got your release there for when you're actually rewind the film, ratchet release. So there we go, that's the Halina 3000. 2000, well, pretty much exactly the same camera, to be honest. Of course, the main difference is you've got no selenium cell and you've got no built-in sort of light meter. So the idea was with this camera is that you would probably have to not only guess your actual distance of your subject, but you could sort of try and guess the exposure as well, you know, depending on a bright day, probably somewhere between sort of f8, 5.6, f11. Failing that, you would need obviously one of these, which was basically a handheld light meter, and but most times you would probably just sort of, you know, guess it and stick it to say 125 and just sort of bracket accordingly. These are still available on eBay, come up fairly regularly. The more popular camera is the 3000, and I must admit I have noticed there's quite a few of these come up for spares and repair, so that would indicate that maybe there is a slightly higher failure rate than the Paulette or electronics. So, you know, bear that in mind. It's best to sort of see if you can actually get a picture there with the actual EV light meter actually working, and it's always nice to ask questions to make sure that the actual adjustments there on the lens, you know, all sort of work. For one of these, in this sort of condition, not a lot of money really. Expect to pay probably something between £5 and £10, occasionally 15 if you get one that's actually in a case. The 2000, well, it's actually a little rarer, wasn't so popular I don't think. Obviously without the light meter you're a little bit restricted if you intend to use it as a camera. From a collector's point of view, it doesn't really make a lot of difference, to be honest. Again, price wise, I think I paid about £3 for this camera. So, you know, you're not talking really very much for these cameras. So, you know, just get yourself on eBay, and really for the perhaps the price of a beer, you get yourself a really quite a nice retro 70s camera.